Thanks, Christian. As mentioned, Generation Rent is a new campaign looking for a fair and sustainable private rented sector. And in practice, what that means is redressing the balance that we currently have where all the power is with homeowners and landlords, and there's virtually very little power with tenants and people looking to rent in the capital. But I think one thing just to mention before I go on to talk specifically about the PRS is that we've got to remember that we really need to take a holistic view of housing, not just in terms of how renting and social housing and home ownership link up, but the way that housing underpins the health system, education, transport, welfare, skills and construction, the list could go on. It's a central part of the way our economy functions, and getting it right is vital for all of those areas. As already mentioned, the central concern for private renters in London is affordability. But before I go on to talk about cost of rents and other issues around that, I just wanted to quickly mention other problems that renters face that people who aren't in the private rented sector are just kind of not aware of potentially. I mean, clearly there is a massive issue around security of tenure, and that underpins other problems for renters. If you can be evicted for no reason by your landlord with 2 months' notice, what kind of power does that give you if you want to complain about the way they're treating you, if you want to complain about the conditions in your house? But also, what does it say about how you engage with your community, with your friends and neighbours, if you just don't know how long you're going to be there? So we very much back ideas to increase security of tenure, to have some sort of minimum, much longer term tenancies, which allow people to live for several years in a single place, knowing that they can't be evicted just for no reason. And in a way would also give landlords some sort of predictable income. It's not something they should immediately be shouting down about. Christian also mentioned ideas around management of the PRS. So we're very much in favour of licensing schemes, both for letting agents and for landlords, that actually begin to regulate these sectors. I mean, at the moment, no one knows how many private landlords there are in the country. This is an absurdity when they're looking after people's homes. And one thing particularly for London that we think is important is looking at local authority letting agents rather than the unregulated sort of sector of sharks and kind of profiteers, because if you have a local authority running a letting agent, they can immediately run that on a not-for-profit basis. You're cutting out all those huge upfront fees that people have to pay, and you can oversee how the homes are managed a lot better. Just before I then go back to affordability, the other central issue for renters, particularly from lower incomes, but this does apply to all sorts of people, is conditions within their property and actually being able to ensure that homes and flats are kept well. At the moment, the way that conditions are policed in the private rented sector just isn't really working. There's a lot of reasons for that, but essentially cuts to environmental health on local authorities, but also knowledge amongst renters, and also how you actually measure when there's a problem within the PRS, all have their problems. So we would suggest that there needs to be a review of how the housing health and safety rating system works for private rented homes, and look at ways to ensure renters are actually empowered to be able to complain about conditions without fear of eviction, which again goes back to that security of tenure issue. So just to quickly speak then on affordability, we clearly for Londoners, and particularly young Londoners who don't have well-paid jobs, or people who are moving to the capital for work, rent is just a ridiculous level of their outgoings at the moment. And what we have to think about is a way not just to protect people from the biggest excesses which are going on, i.e. something like the German model where you can limit rent rises across a number of years. You also have to look at how we can start to build genuinely affordable homes for the private rented sector where the rents as a result are much lower. Because if you just cap rents as they are now, for people of my generation and younger, people coming out of university now, they're just a ridiculous amount of money. There's no way you can build up a capital asset. There's no way you can start to save for other things. And of course that hits the economy more widely because you're then looking at less spending in other sectors. You're looking at loads of rents going to a relatively few number of people, i.e. the landlords, and money being hoarded in that way. So just one idea on the affordable section, and this would go alongside more spending on social housing, but when we're looking specifically at private rented, if you have this HCA £1 billion budget, which on our estimation could build, these are all rough figures, but say 10,000 homes at £100,000. If you start building that on public land that the state takes, you're then immediately cutting out a third of the price potentially for the sell-on when they do go on the open market. If you're doing it through a non-profit system, you're also able to take away that 100 grand that they add on top for a profit. And if you start to think about ways of building what we would call a secondary housing market, i.e. one that's insulated from constant rises, i.e. one where people can buy these houses at say 100,000, but they know that they're not going to suddenly inflate in price over the years, but that's reflected in their much lower investment that they're currently putting in. And at the same time, if they then want to rent those homes, they are buying into a rent cap. So suddenly they know that they're not going to make a huge amount from being able to hike wages, but they've just bought a home for £100,000 in London. That seems to us one way to start to build a load more cheaper homes. But the beauty of this idea, unlike other kind of funding ideas for housing, is that once those homes have been built and sold, you've immediately got the £1 billion back. You can use it again and again to build another 10,000 homes. Now I can already foresee objections to this, which we can speak about later on, but we think there's quite an obvious way to start to self-fund homes that go on a secondary market and are then subject to caps that allow them to stay affordable permanently. But alongside policy ideas, the other area that Generation Rent is really working on is looking at how we can organise renters to give them a political voice, not just for the coming general election, but obviously in the sort of medium term, of course, the mayoral elections. And something that Generation Rent is really trying to do is build up a social base of renters groups around the country in every local authority that can be used both to lobby their council to support each other in housing struggles, but also to show that there is actually a renters bloc there who will vote on the basis of policies in the PRS and on housing. Because as has been mentioned earlier, and as Jonathan and I were saying before, because private renters aren't seen as natural voters, and to be honest, they aren't, they have been ignored for too long. But we believe that by organising people on a local basis and showing that they will vote on these issues and giving them input and representation and consultation on housing in their areas, that there's a very strong way that we can start to improve private renting just through that alone. Just two other quick political implications though as well for a sector that has doubled in the numbers in the last 10 years and is going to be a permanent amount of our housing stock and isn't going away anytime soon. Traditionally, when we thought about housing in this country, you'd see as people got older, became homeowners, they'd start to essentially slide towards conservatism, be more likely to vote Tory. People in the social rented sector were more likely to be Labour voters. If we have this mass amount of people who are now in the private rented sector for not just 2, 3, 5 years, for a decade, 15 years, what does that actually say about their political affiliations? And surely like anyone who's looking at the future of British politics should be thinking about these things a lot more strongly than they currently are. Their affiliation is unknown, but if they become a voting bloc, then surely all the mainstream political parties have to start thinking about how they can capture that vote and how they can show that actually supporting the private rented sector will both be supporting the general economy and London's economy specifically, but also showing that they're actually on the side of millions of new renters and voters coming into this country each year. Thanks.